The Mazda CX-30, this city cruiser, I should call it probably. I've already driven it, but I've never driven it with the Skyactiv-X engine, which is underneath here. And I was opening the hood just a few moments ago, and I was quite surprised by the fact that everything fits so perfectly. Like all of these models, like they were designed to take the X engine, because it seems to be slightly bigger than your regular engine. But yeah, this should be interesting.
Right, well, Mazda's engineers definitely knew in advance they'll be putting the X into these models. I'm not entirely sold about the rear with the 30, but I like the other three sides.
There's something I was wondering for quite a while now, and it doesn't quite compute. So people buy German cars because of their reliability and so on and so forth. People buy Korean cars because, yeah, they buy Korean cars, but why don't more people buy Mazdas? Because as far as I can see it, they're equally as priced or cheaper usually, and well, they're better to drive in a lot of cases, and they're beautifully made. So why are people not buying more of them?
You don't have to trust me either. If you're buying a new car, go to a Mazda dealership and sit in their cars. Or even better, drive them.
So, why do people not buy more Mazdas? From where I'm sitting, it's really impossible to say why. Because they're nicely made, like I said, they're very nice to drive, they're very good to look at. And you know, one more thing, whenever we get test cars, and we know about them in advance, of course, usually I go, ooh, that's going to be quite interesting, or oh, that's going to be quite fun, or you know, what am I gonna say for that one? It's gonna be a bit tough. But for Mazdas, I always think, ooh, that's going to be lovely. And you know what? For pretty much every car from Mazda we always had, or we ever had, it was lovely. The only reason I can think of is that people just forget about it. They don't think about a Mazda when they're buying a car. They just, I don't know, just forget that the brand exists. So if you're buying a car, used or new, make yourself a favor next time and go look at a Mazda as well, because they are just so nice. So after this unpaid promotion of Mazda, let's go to the engine. I have to say that the very first time I drove the X engine, I thought it was a bit mediocre because, well, as always, I'm used to turbocharged cars and diesels, which means they've got a lot of torque from down low, and you don't really have to shift that much to get a lot of torque and power out of it. But of course, Mazda has traditionally stuck to a lot of non-turbocharged cars, and this is sort of the same, naturally aspirated, even though yes, it does have a supercharger, but it's very small and blah blah blah. Let's not get into that. But the more I'm driving these X engines, and now these slightly updated X engines as well, the more I'm falling in love with it. Because one, it gives me back that childhood experience of driving naturally aspirated cars, so I can really take it up to the limit and still have all that torque all the time. Well, sort of. You know, it's just fun. And you don't have such huge fuel consumption because, of course, it works with that sort of diesel-like compression ignition, spark assisted, of course. So, being naturally aspirated, what does that mean? I've said that many times already with the X engine. Well, if you don't have an automatic, you're going to have to shift parapraxis. You're going to have to shift a little bit more. I'm in fourth at the moment, 1500 RPM. If I put my foot down, nothing really happens. So I have to put it into second, 3000 RPM, and then you can actually feel 90 kilometers per hour. This thing is actually pretty torquey. But you have to remember, if you're going from a diesel or a turbocharged engine, you have to shift down. And you can't just shift one gear. You have to go 2, 3 gears. This thing loves to rev up to 6,500 RPMs. And it's going to be happy to do it. And of course, being Mazda, it probably isn't going to brake. It will surprise you. It actually surprised me right there, and I've been driving it for a while. But you know, usually I don't like to just push it. I like to drive fairly economically. But yeah, that was surprisingly torquey and fun, actually. You know, that's the nice thing. You don't have just a tiny RPM range like you have on a diesel. Well, it's gotten better over the years, but you've got, you know, all the way up to 6.5. So, while this engine, I've said it many times, is not a racer, and it was never meant to be a racer. This is meant to be sort of a revolutionary engine, which it is, using gas or gasoline or petrol, but with a much lower fuel consumption and emissions. And I think it does that. I cannot really say anything about emissions because I'm not a chemist or a scientist, but as far as the fuel consumption, I've always driven these cars quite economically because I wanted to see what was the lowest number I could get it to. But for this one, I specifically decided I'm not going to drive economically, I'm going to drive normally. So I'm not going to race it, but I'm not going to be like, oh, can I get, you know, 0.1 of a liter per 100 kilometers less? I gotta slow down here and be careful and feather the throttle. No, I just drove it normally. So, the lowest fuel consumption I had, and if you do a lot of sort of reasonable driving at around 60 to 90 kilometers per hour with not a lot of traffic or traffic stops, you're gonna actually, I saw 3.4 liters per 100 kilometers, which is fantastic for a 2-liter petrol car or gas car. But in the real world, if you're gonna be driving a lot in the cities and such, and not being extremely careful, but not being a hooligan either, you're gonna see around 5.0 liters. Plus minus, of course, a little bit. Right now it's showing me 5.2, but that's because I was doing those power runs to show you how nicely it accelerates. But you know, there's gonna be a range depending on how you drive. But realistically, if you drive it just normally and are not really paying that much attention to the fuel economy, it's going to be around 5, which I think for the torque and the power of this car and how nicely it drives is actually quite impressive. So I'm not going to be going on and on and on about the X engine because I've done a few videos on it already. If you'd like to know more of my thoughts about how it drives, you should look at my other Mazda X videos. I go into more in-depth about the engine there, not really technically so much, but how it just drives. And for a final thought, I think I would just like to touch back on the whole, why don't people buy more Mazdas? And like I said, whenever I know that we're gonna get a Mazda, I think to myself, oh, that's going to be lovely. And like I said, every time, there were no exceptions. Every time I did drive a Mazda, I thought, man, this is so nice. I want this car. When I drove the 6, I thought, I want to buy this car someday. When I drove the 3, I want to buy this car someday. The same, if I was looking for an SUV or a crossover, I'm not really a fan of them, but yes, this drives really nice, despite the fact that it's a crossover. So, I really, really, really like the Mazdas, and I really like what they're doing. And I think it's unfair that people aren't really considering them for some reason. Like I said, maybe they just forget about them. So there you go. Another unscheduled, unpaid promotion of Mazda. Mazda, time to get in touch with me. Give me my millions.
The CX-30 with the X engine starts at 26,000 euros. For the all-wheel drive model with an automatic transmission and extra equipment, you'll be paying just over 36,000 euros.